Fellas, I got bad news. The Scarlet and Violet DLC came out several months ago, and I never covered it. Look, I can pull excuses all I want, but as for today, we gotta go in with a bit of a deep dive to rectify that problem. After all, it'll never hurt to have a standalone video on the topic to address all of it now, would it? Actually, why have I not done one of these for Sword and Shield yet? Good question. But those are irrelevant personal problems. Regardless, here today, we're gonna outline everything the Scarlet and Violet DLC experience is to see if it's good as DLC, or as addition to Scarlet and Violet, or even if it's worth the money in the first place. Although that's way more subjective. Also, I'm going to tack on some game updates to previously covered topics at the end where things have changed for them. But that part's optional, short, and avoidable thanks to timestamps. You're welcome. Regardless, that's all for preambles, so let's just get into this. Structured exactly like it would for a full game review, to leave no stone unturned. In terms of getting bang for your buck, where else to begin but the massive play space? Because we get two big ol' open zone sized maps, both being notably smaller than the base game map in a bit of a good way. Yes, the odd case of smaller being better. Here, we're going to brand new locations. One with Kitakami that is a bit mid, and maybe hurt by terrain that just feels a little bit annoying. And of course the Blueberry Academy, featuring more school stuff that not a single soul asked for, alongside 5 separate distinct biomes, while the gameplay focus has a distinct identity of double battle trainers, making the gameplay stand out far more, as if the terrain itself visually wasn't doing the job already, giving us both a relaxed natural land and a very artificial one for contrast. We also get a little bit of an expansion for Area Zero, but this has way less value outside of the plot. Look, there's not much else to say about the land. It's just normal Scarlet and Violet behavior, but more condensed. So we advance. Traversing these open environments, things are usually open out the gates. Some areas either want water travel or wall climbing, but with enough work you can just do it regardless. Again, in most circumstances, without needing much in story progression, obviously made better with it. But as for our riding mount, we actually get new content that the base game lacked. Particularly, we have the post-DLC stories unlock a full-blown flight. Because if gliding just was not enough already, the simple ability to just gain height essentially revolutionizes air travel in ways that gliding of course never could. Any navigation skill issue you've ever had just simply fades away with this definitive endgame reward. Why eliminating most overworld travel works for an endgame reward, as there's not really anything left to do by this point, which is of course made better when this reward just does not have any in-battle impact at all. It's just overworld navigation to access stuff that you already could have, but even easier and faster. It's truly great and honestly probably should have been here in the first place. And yes, for lesser travel purposes, fast travel's here as well, but there is no catch. The DLC areas just have their own easily unlocked fast travel points. Exactly as you'd expect, I mean, come on now. Meanwhile, traveling between the 3 worlds is just interrupted by a longer loading screen and nothing else, of course, just being swell. For the worlds themselves, there's still not much left to talk about. Like, that's almost it for gameplay. Like, look at this, dude. What's left at this point is essentially just a day-night cycle. While it's unfortunately still unalterable, the 3 main areas themselves are on different cycles of the day, essentially always allowing daytime and nighttime to coexist at the same time without twiddling your thumbs for that hour-long cycle of light and their gameplay benefits to just swap between the two. For the play space itself, that's just it. It's just 2 big dumb open sandbox to obviously house the gameplay with all their silly little quirks. One feels generally good to play around in, while both feel like they have just enough in terms of variety to make mainland Paldea look a bit like a meme in contrast. So yeah, whatever, let's just get to the silly battling stuff instead of me pretending to even care about this. In terms of the core battle system, we got new goodies on board, and where else to start than terrestrialization? Because here we got a brand new Terra type, and it just does not work very well. So here's the question: what's so bad about the Stellar Terra type, and why is it a bit of a waste? Well, unlike normal terraing, and how it completely shifts the mon's type charts, completely warping defensive profiles while adding additional offense, or further improving upon existing offense, here the Stellar Terra type actively does not change the mon's defensive profile whatsoever. It's purely offensive, meaning arguably the most valuable end of terrestrializing just does not even exist, massively hindering the skill floor the feature can provide, which massively limits the recipients that could effectively use it. And offensively, it's just a bit underwhelming. Instead of a normal 1.5x boost granted from the normal Terras for the one type, here it's an expert belt level boost of 1.2x, but only once per type on non-stab attacks. Meaning, let's say your Tauros had Ice Beam and Blizzard. Don't ask why, it's intentionally over-exaggerated. exaggerated. Only the first attack of the two will ever be boosted only once. Meanwhile, your Mon's same type attacks do receive a much larger boost, which are just doubled like normal Terras, except, again, only once. It's mainly only ever used to tap into many different types of attacks for different coverage options over the span of shorter battles. Meanwhile, the two Stellar-typed moves only provide super effective damage to other Terran Mons, while not really being resisted, being a massive bummer when you remember that you can only have a single Terran Mon on a team. The issue is, in prolonged scenarios, the value you get out of the Stellar Terra is just much worse due to lacking that defensive utility, while quickly losing that offensive pressure as well, which can leave your very valuable Terra Mon as a bit of a liability more times than not. In most circumstances, the value ceiling is just lower because of the small group of Mons that can actually take advantage of the Terra. Again, something like Toxapex will physically never use it, meanwhile the Mons that do want to use it are usually very frail and fast and strong. There's of course other nuances laying around, like opportunity cost and the such, but I think you get the picture. A Stellar Terra type just kind of fails in a vacuum, as of course that lack of defensive utility kills any need for defensive Mons to run the Terra, and offensive Mons can't cheat death with it either. Meanwhile, offensively speaking, it fumbles because your boosts are essentially on a timer, which again is something defensive Mons will never use, and offensive Mons typically don't want to stick around very long with it. Normal Terras 99% of the time are sadly just better, again in a vacuum. But speaking of terroring, thankfully for us in general, it's a little bit better this time as well. As upon completing the Indigo Disc storyline, you get the ability to remove the Terra Orb's charged nonsense, so you can spam it to your heart's content instead of it blocking you out of the future after you've used it too many times without healing. It's so small and minuscule, but it's an improvement. But even better is that getting Terra Shards are just more easily accessible in the DLC, as piles can be found around in the open areas for a short term, more easy to get supply to swap types with, while also having a new item to help make them spawn more in general. Again, this was one of the biggest issues with Terra types in base game, that it was really time demanding grinding wise. Another Terra related thing comes down to new Pokemon, as Terrapagos and Ogerpon have locks on their Terra typing preventing you from changing them, mainly because they have unique qualities baked into them through their form changes. With Ogerpon, the type is tied to its form, and when it terrestrializes, congrats, it gets a new ability on top of the boost. Yes, they actually gave the Fire one an unnerfed Intrepid Sword because game balancing doesn't matter. In the same generation they nerfed it. Terrapagos, on the other hand, is a bit different. Again, with a form change, this time featuring plenty of stats. A new ability, but most importantly, it lacks the temporariness drawbacks of actually using the Stellar Terra, always getting the full power. Although the sad part about this is, again, these are form changes, important ones, that are tied down to the region's battle gimmick. So luckily for us, next generation, you know Terrapagos is still going to be a restricted Pokemon without access to its Uber stat line. Yep, it's going to be completely worthless. What a shame. In terms of other minor gameplay mechanical changes, we're only really left with Mons, as of course 4 of them had minor ability changes, but the real, oh wait, hey, this is different thing, is that some of the critters have new form changing details. While I covered a bit of the data mined fellas back in the previous video, it turned out Game Freak wanted more. The actual new thing since then is Deoxys actually gets its form changed via a key item finally. Although it's annoying because you have to use it multiple times because it swaps its forms out on a cycle, rather than just letting you pick which one you want. Otherwise, the scrolls have been covered as Khufu's evolution stones, except they are unlimited use, thankfully, and the items for the origin forms have a new system that is getting explained right now. TLDR, the PLA items are held to change their forms with a minor damage multiplier that we previously saw in the Grisius orb, leaving the old orbs to be completely worthless because they have the exact same damage multiplier as the other items, you know, the ones that the Mons will actually benefit from. I'm sorry, but making these items directly outclassed was a bit of a mistake. Just completely power creeping them in a way that's just not funny whatsoever. Also, different here, these legendaries lost their exclusive traits dependent on the form they were in that they had in PLA to alter their main attack. Yeah, that's boring. It's probably better this way, but it's boring. Which means, hey look, Mons are done. What do we even have left at this point? We have new items in the lineup, that's cool. We have the obligatory form changing items, evolution related junk, and a wide variety of additional TMs, which we all really enjoy. But no single addition, in my opinion, clears that of the Fresh Start Mochi, an item that simply nukes all the EV investments into a Mon, which is just too damn convenient for me to not glaze. But yeah, that's just about it for our mechanical side of things, which means we get to pivot to the fun parts. As for actually playing through the DLCs, it's just a bit weird. As with the Teal Mask, you can go here as early as the game's tutorial with all the school junk being done, finally unlocking the ability to ride on your legendary. And Kitakami itself is a lot like Sword and Shield's Isle of Armor, as the experience is built on 2 different sets of levels depending on whether or not you've beaten the main game. Regardless of progress, all the Teal Mask plot is available from start to finish. With the Indigo Disc, the main bulk of plot and gameplay is locked until after the Teal Mask and main story is finished, thankfully made very obvious due to text. However, you can go to Blueberry very early after your first 2 battles with your besties in Kitakami. From here though, you have access to all the play space, at least the important ones, your defaulting wild encounters, and floor items being available essentially out the gate, just really being locked out of plot and side content until the other place is dealt with. All of that is the big setup that leads us into everything else that we're about to see. So first, we begin with Pokemon. Both DLCs end up packing Mons uniquely, and base game even weaves itself into the offering by merely existing. So what does this look like? You know damn well I'm going to start counting these Mons, despite that being the last thing you want to hear. Well, dear viewer, it goes something like this. We take the 402-ish from base game, or less depending on when you pull up, add 7 brand new Pokemon, 88 returning Mons, 3 of which are regional variants, plus 9 more that I'm kind of ignoring right now as they have later availability. So with the Teal Mask only, we're already at 500 options. Tapping into Blueberry's supply, but still available before finishing the Teal Mask stuff, we get an extra 6 brand new Mons, 81 returning friends, and 17 regional reskins. Meaning before that nonsense of story is even dealt with, another 104 more options are on the table. Another 72 open up later once the League Club is accessible for some pure nonsense of 176 within the Blueberry Academy. Tapping into the final story arcs and post-game though, we get 24 absolute units pulling up, 21 through just a nonsense feature, 2 as mythicals, and of course Terrapagos. Meaning 676 critters are open for the taking across all of Scarlet and Violet. Although that's not all, as sadly several Mons are transfer or event only within their availability. 2 new Mons, but they're actually tournament legal, unlike mythicals because Game Freak hates you. 41 unique other Mons, like legendaries and other insanely broken stuff, and 19 regional variant-esque Mons for a lineup of 736, but not really, funsies within the game. Your ability to experiment truly never ends. Although the game's level progression sure is trying its best to bottleneck the experience and struggles to actually do so. So here's the deal. We brushed by the whole Kitakami's weirdities already when it comes to levels, particularly the 2 distinct levels related for their experiences. Now, while movesets, evolutions, and sometimes items is altered between the 2 takes, ultimately levels is what will end up mattering the most. Playing the DLC directly from the post-game, the level curve is actually pretty damn good. Although there is a bit of a rough patch where the Royal 3 just feel a little bit too tanky because they seem a bit over-leveled, but like standalone 1 boss mon, so it works. But otherwise, it's never going to be a grind fest from start to finish, as this level curve was at least handled with care. Playing it as early as possible though, that's where things get a bit rough, because by that point, you get stat checked pretty badly. While winning the first battles with Carmen and Kieran are not quite necessary, you will realize soon enough that the DLC is built like base game Scarlet and Violet. So we get another issue where all the trainers are completely optional. So EXP is going to be more dry than you'd hope. So getting underleveled is very easy to do. Yes, pacing is somehow a bit of a problem, and it plays this way for basically the entirety of the Teal Mask. But the biggest issue is the fact that you've not actually beaten the game yet, meaning we'll have a similar problem that the Freedom and Choice Enthusiasts games will end up having as well. You gain levels in Kitakami, which will throw you off past any shred of challenge for base game. And then the same issues come in when you try delaying the Kitakami nonsense because you're busy progressing the main story. Basically, it just ends up muddying the experience by allowing you to steamroll basically everything, yes, either Kitakami or Paldea, but not as much, pretty easily, really making Kitakami itself feel more appealing as a bit of a post-game thing rather than just a main game detour. In terms of the Indigo Disc, thankfully everything here just rides off as raw post-game content material, meaning leveling is never a problem whatsoever. Although there's 2 problems sticking out like sore thumbs. The first inconvenience comes to the first Lacey battle, since you can come here shortly after you have your Kitakami arrival, meaning you can pull up here to unlock the terrarium as soon as humanly possible, which, if you haven't beaten the game yet, you're just going to force yourself into an instant loss because you go from fighting low 10s to 20s straight to 70s. Thankfully though, it's another one of those fights that you can progress despite losing. Our actual one issue when it comes to the level curve though is the wild Pokemon levels, as they don't actually have 2 separate sets of levels to compare to with actual story progress and and not. Meaning if you come here before beating the game, good news boys and girls, you get to come in here and catch a bunch of blatantly overleveled Pokemon, if you want any of them for the main game use. Which, don't forget, it's Scarlet and Violet, so Pokemon level obedience issues are going to rear their ugly head. But as for now, with levels, that's just about it. Mainly being handicapped for those that have not yet beaten the game. In terms of progressing through the DLC though, there's not too much to say. The Kitakami stuff is super linear, with the exception of the Loyal 3 nonsense, where freedom of choice actually does exist despite being very short-lived. The Blueberry Academy Elite 4 is very similar with its freedom of choice. The issue though is the fact we have the base game gym challenges, but for each of the 4 peoples. 3 of these are just complete and utter non-issues that are not even worth mentioning, outside of 2 of them lacking any form of trainer battles prior. But with Drayton's challenge, we get a bit of a pace breaker that's really annoying to deal with if you don't know it's coming, as they force you to do a few trainer battles, locking you out of mons caught outside of the terrarium, basically preventing you from progressing the game with the mons you've been using up to this point, unless you came to Blueberry early. The battles themselves are actually deceptively fine, as their levels are compensated for the fact that you're using junk that you just caught. Although we have the silly issue that is a single text box holding you back from an inevitable disaster that is the Drayton team level jump, which is why we gotta be glad the team lock ruling only exists for the trainers instead of also having him, because if not, this would be a far greater issue than just a mild one. Anyways, after the 4 things are done, the game basically becomes hyperlinear, and that's about it, outside of the epilogue's key item requirement being dumb and probably at some point in the future impossible to get should the servers ever shut down. In terms of side plot, Perrin's quests require a certain amount of mons in the Pokedex to be caught, alongside of the Blueberry Academy one needing Kitakami to be finished. While it's grindy, it's not the worst thing in the world, and leveling is just a complete and utter non-issue here. But that's just about it for Kitakami. In Blueberry's case, Perrin's request to go find the 2 Paradox mons is a bit unreasonable, because they want you to catch 200 Pokemon from the Blueberry Pokedex, which you might not think that's a problem at first, especially if you use Pokemon Home to cheat the dex like I do, mainly because by default, you cannot get 200 Pokemon through the Pokedex here. As we'll see later, that will require grinding, because you know grinding can sneak itself in here somehow. It is inevitable, and it's always here to haunt the games. But whatever, you catch the 2 things, you're done. Good job. Regardless, that's your progress. It really does not take that much out of a base game's playbook in terms of its massive freedom of choice. Here, they went hyperlinear, and for the most part, it works without fault, which means we get to carry on again, throwing us at boss teams. Probably the most pointless section of this entire video, because there's not really much to critique outside of like White. The post-game teams for Kieran and Carmi having the same unevolved slop that their, hey, I haven't beaten the game yet, story teams had. Like, I guess all of the Blueberry Elite 4 ditching that self-enforced rule of all monotype teams that Terra-ing surprisingly does not fix. While existing as issues, I guess, they're not really too cataclysmic in the grand scheme of things, if I'm going to be honest with you. After all, it's not an exception if everyone breaks the rule. While that's typically where we'd round out this section, we lack somewhere else to talk about the bug fixes in this video, so we'll just do it now. And yeah, some have been rectified. Notably, the alternate forms of mass outbreaks actually work as intended now instead of defaulting to the normal forms. Some actual non-bugs like spawns in this lake have been reduced so it lags less, among other small stuff that I'm totally drawing a massive blank on. But no, the game is not in good standing when looking from a technical standpoint, which may I remind you is that this is the game's complete form. Yes, still packing unholy frame drops, plus whatever Reddit footage you see on screen, because yes, more disasters lie intact for no reason whatsoever. Holy hell, who made this game? Thankfully, the actual content in question is fine, just dealing with minor impact from Scarlet and Violet's technical end, as always. Diving straight into future-related content, there's plenty, but a shame as the density is skewed towards Blueberry Academy, so Kitakami feels like a complete nothing fest for no reason whatsoever. So first yeah, it's just more to pre-existing features. Raids and mass outbreaks. No way, there's more, so act surprised. The only thing to really note here is that they have their own unique lineups that get to coexist between the 3 lands, again similar to Sword and Shield with their raids. Man, that's so cool. Trainer customization also has more added, but to a notable extent. Primarily because the primary clothing, the shirt plus pants stuff, just has more to pull from. Base game had so little lacking in color options, so the outfit options just looked bad from never being able to match. Now there's just a lot more on the table, despite of course still sadly being limited. One complaint though, that's the whole, hey, let's change your fit during the main story garbage, because it changes what you've got. In the case of the teal mask, it even changes your hairstyle, being the much larger sin, and you just have to deal with it. Which is ironic given the previous DLC did not have that problem whatsoever, despite still having the outfit swap. But no! Now go track down the hair salon, because the question of why you'll never be able to do it in a menu will never go answered. Photo taking gets better through a selfie stick alongside more photo taking tools. Stuff like that is the minuscule bettering of what you've already had. From here, we have actual new content. So first, the only feature in Kitakami. It's Ogre Oustin, a minigame where you meander around to pop balloons to fetch and deposit berries. And yeah, it just kind of blows. It's basically nothing other than a distraction. Moving towards the Blueberry Academy features, it was actually quite a lot. Although sadly, it needs story progression to partake in. The Synchro Machine is the literally why, but no way that's so cool feature, as it lets you just control a Pokemon of choice to run around and manually do the auto battle and let's go feature nonsense with. It's one of those silly but not really needed features that helps the game feel more content complete. Plus, playable Golden Go goes hard for no reason whatsoever. Another feature on the same wavelength would be the flying time trials. While forced once in the story, essentially you'll end up flying through rings against the timer while of course flying about. Ultimately just being nothing because there's not really much of a challenge or anything of real substance for that matter. Moving towards the more meaningful stuff, we got features all tied down to one big thing, that being the Blueberry quests and its currency system. Okay, so get this. On your D-pad, you get access to a challenge list to do arbitrary tasks from a small pool that reward you with funds that get spent in a variety of ways, like small use in the DLC 2 plot for some reason, but as a standalone point fetching system, man, these yields feel pretty tragic, and the challenges themselves sure as hell are not helping, because some of them can be tedious and all of them feel a bit repetitive. All of this helps feed into the League Club feature, a hub with varying features being a weird hangout spot for the game's characters. Here though, it's just trying to milk you dry and pickpocket all the BP you've built up for stuff. Stuff includes a wide variety of junk, like unlucky new ball throwing styles, and most importantly, those worthless stepping stones the starter Pokemon are to make getting the mons you actually want possible, and similar other minuscule rewards to partake in receiving. It's just a shame the prices, mainly the starter Pokemon, are just all over the place. With more point demand ruining your afternoon, we got the coaching system. Here you spend points to invite a bestie over, to actually get some character from them, battling them as a source of more important trainer rematches. Yes, even the Elite Four's here this time, although sadly present in their original battle formats. And of course you can even get trades out of them as well, but that's not beating the previous height. I'll be real here. Overall, it's a pretty great addition. Again, sadly blocked by a wall of time called grinding. Speaking of grinding, that also feeds into our next feature being the item printer. Essentially, you take some BP and crafting materials to essentially play a gacha game with a mind-boggling variety of rewards. Very useful in getting more of a finite type of resource, but that point grind, of course, it just makes it less appealing. While hardly a feature, this complete goober here wants you to complete those quests. Doing so will allow you to find some legendary Pokemon. Wow, no way, who cares? He's just tied to something else, no way. That's the only reason he's being mentioned, we'd forget about him otherwise. Meaning now our other features. First is a new auction vendor, which I never got to appear when fetching footage, which is actually great because the rewards are simply not worth a damn. Moving on, because completing the post-game Terrapico story will upgrade the Academy Ace tournament for another wave of better teams, because Game Freak really heard the people when they thought Geeta's team was absolutely pitiful in execution. So now, better. And so are the other countless trainers that you've battled prior. The only unfortunate thing is just the lack of new challengers, which finally will leave us with Pokemon Go connectivity. Okay, by linking the game with Pogo, you in Scarlet and Violet can receive the game's postcards with a weird result, being the wild Scatterbug, Spupa, and Pavilion in the world will have their evolved form match that of the region's indicated form for a small 24-hour period. So instead of being stuck in the fancy pattern, you can finally get more now. Not that you would. Yeah, that's all it does in the context of Scarlet and Violet, meaning that's where we'll drop it for the features for now. While there's a bit of it, and some is pretty well constructed, you may have noticed we lack larger scale features. You know, something like Dynamax Adventures or that battle facility like things Sword and Shield had, for instance. Which means, unfortunately, the content you can partake in just feels a bit less impactful from a gameplay perspective. Primarily having a better flow than anything, but hey, I mean, at least they went back and updated something, right? In terms of the story, we begin in what feels like a bit of a spin-off adventure, seemingly too detached from that of the main story. Here, it kind of works because it's a main plot line that actually ties both bits of DLC together. One solid adventure, whereas the Sword and Shield DLC was worse off due to just being two small separate narratives. So with that good starting signal, let's begin. Kicking the adventure off, you're invited down to Kitakami for a school trip, being nothing, serving as an invitation to drag you into new plot with the DLC's new friends, because apparently you didn't have enough already. already. Regardless of the plot just sending you to locations, ultimately you're just goofing off with the silly mean one and the main focal point of both DLCs. The plot begins to thicken when you're dragged off to a festival, and after doing one bit of filler content, plot happens where the local Shrek population shows up and exists for a bit before dropping its mask, hitting you with that eyebrow, of course, heading out. From here, returning the mask is the top priority, but that's nothing when you gotta lie to Kieran about Ogerpon's existence despite his almost obsession with it, pretty much neutering any friendship the two of you can have when he overhears it. He gets a hold of the mask prefixing and accidentally causes trouble when the 3 panes in the rear have to exist for about 15 minutes while you recover Ogerpon's other mask from them to make the funny creature's day, where it wants to join you until Kieran obsessively jumps in to battle over it, in which you completely and utterly crush him, setting off a switch in his brain for character growth, in which that I would assume was a good cliffhanger that I was unfortunately never able to experience at the time. But anyways, you do the thing, you get the Ogerpon, meaning not only is it time for you to leave, but for Carmen and Kieran to leave for Blueberry Academy because education is actually a good thing. With that said, that's the teal mask. From here, you go join another school over some nonsense, finally being able to advance the plot after you went here earlier to prep for Drayton's trial in advance. So after catching up with your bestie, you get Kieran acting like a completely different person before being requested to help him not be that way. You get dragged off to fight the Blueberry Academy Elite Four. So after quickly fetching every W between the four, it's time for the big battle, which in fact is a very pleasant climax. After all, you're such a great friend, taunting with the Ogerpon he couldn't have, knocking him down to a title of former champion, and best of all, getting a celebratory photo. This right here alone would be a nice finish. If you didn't notice, DLC 2 just isn't done yet, because now it's time for the title of the DLC to kick in. You're requested to go to Area 0 and find its secrets armed with a disc and nothing really more. The teacher, Kieran, and his sister tag along, sitting through dialogue hell that's just not very fun, and Game Freak knows that. Together, y'all are able to go even deeper. Yeah, it's a bit of a Minecraft reference. And here this so-called treasure hunt finds its conclusion. You come to find Terrapagos, and Kieran obviously selfishly wants to find him as well. And oh no, the Terrapagos wants to join you. Wait a second, is that deja vu? Well, almost, because Kieran catches the legendary this time, and then battles you over it with his petty rivalry. After not even breaking a sweat and some peer pressure to follow, he terrestrializes the Terrapagos, and now everything goes wrong. It's got 3 a.m. at Denny's vibes, and now stopping the funny turtle is the top priority in what's basically a scripted battle. Starting with Kieran just being mentally broken to being helpful in the battle because he's finally beating that mental hurdle. The thing is beat and now you catch it. The day is saved, Kieran finally forgives you and wants to start over. And that's where the story also hypothetically ends, which would assume the Switch servers are going to inevitably die one day. Of course, there's a weird bit with the professor and completing the cycle with the colored book back where it probably should not be, but the big final story piece, thanks to Mystery Gift, we get an epilogue to dive into. Essentially, you take your Paldean friends, finally, good lord, they've been neglected this entire time, on a pointless adventure to Kitakami where everything goes wrong. People get mind-jacked or whatever, and nonsense is just around every corner till the Petulant is dealt with and caught. Then everyone's fine, and wow, this just sucks. Only really needing to exist in order to give Kieran his chance to shine post-Indigo Disc. And in that regard, it isn't half bad, if you just ignore the irrelevancy of everything else. Ultimately being a pleasant time, although that's just the main plot. Because sadly, there's a side bit running around existing, as Perrin's little side plots are just, hey, help me find thing or go find thing. Ultimately being nothing but something that of course has to be mentioned. So yeah, that's it. As an add-on to Scarlet and Violet, it's kind of unnecessary due to how little is actually connected to base game. As a narrative in general, it's honestly kind of fine, even if Carmine feels like she's been left out much more than she otherwise should have been. And in contrast to other Pokemon DLCs, one actual narrative actually works in contrast to 2 short ones from Sword and Shield because it's actually pretty on rails and requires one defeating the other to keep the progress up. Plus, on a more in-the-weeds look, I may have ranted about how the characters on average aren't very good from base game. Thankfully, the new ones are handled pretty nicely, and the old ones, through side content, at least get a little bit more on top of that, which is pretty swell. And at the end, not bad at all, but sadly just okay. In a positive sense, it's a fairly enjoyable add-on to a game, just adding more to Scarlet and Violet, similar to that of the base game, with open environments, character-driven plots, and the such. Doing well to capitalize on what the game did a better job with. In a problematic sense, it's just being more Scarlet and Violet means it's not necessarily solving any of the problems that the base game had, but rather making for a more just definitive experience, especially when it comes to a far better endgame. In contrast, as to the Sword and Shield DLC, I would say it's a better product, although it just has a big lack of big identifiable DLC features. Although one of the biggest fumbles, though, comes to not everything being available, despite you whipping out your wallet, which also is not very great when you have to hear about that $5 price increase in contrast to the prior DLC. Still requiring separate purchases between the two games to play it on both. It's just genuinely so cruel. Meaning, yeah, it's verdict time. And look, I'm just gonna leave it straight and simple for you. If you're debating getting the DLC, the question of should you play it ultimately lies on whether or not you enjoyed the base game in the first place. That part should be pretty obvious, but the DLC experience is not just gonna magically change your entire opinions on the game. It's nowhere near enough in terms of lifting power to make that kind of comeback, as it's really just more Scarlet and Violet. In terms of Scarlet and Violet as a complete package now, in a more objective sense, it's still a 3-star experience, but only a tad bit higher now. I mean, the DLC does make the game as a whole better to an extent, right? It's just even now, like, the game still feels a bit content dry. Regardless, that just leaves us with my thoughts here, and I'll just be blunt about it. I don't really care for the DLC. Like, it's okay, significantly better as a post-game, but excluding the lack of features, base game Scarlet and Violet felt conclusive enough. So much, in fact, I really just cannot recommend getting it personally. Like, this is Pokemon we're talking about. It'd be one thing if every mon was attainable with the DLC, but needing Pokemon Home to get Zamazenta and friends just ends up putting more of an emphasis on just trading for the mons instead. Yes, including the new stuff as a much cheaper alternative. Again, that's only one perspective though. If you want like a better perspective, one that actually cares more, comment section's probably got you. If my lack of interest here didn't already show with the obvious lack of colorful scripting and just being blunt about it now, surely should be proof that I do not really, yeah. Anyways, that's it for the important part of the video. Meaning for the 99% of people watching, yeah, you can click off now. We just got the minor stuff or other things to speak on now. Yes, finally, we're at the only other game to have gotten content since last time. With Pokemon TCG Live, it's just exactly what you'd expect. Minor bug fixes, despite being bugged beyond belief. The complete neglect of any updates for bringing back the official expanded format, because they don't want all the cards to be usable yet. Don't be ridiculous. Standard ended up rotating, which means Mew finally got forced out of the format so we can enjoy the game again. More free decks to go alongside the rotation, even if that means everyone has Charizard now. The deck builder's a bit better now, which means yes, the Black and White era ace-back cards are all finally in the trainer card section. Thank goodness my OCD can rest nicely now. They've finally added a battle log so you can actually see things that you missed in game. Yes, this bare minimum feature is finally here. Packs can be bought for the Sun and Moon era sets and whatnot now. Not that you ever would. Other very small changes, like the ranked ladder now requiring less points to progress. And finally, just more sets in general were added, being the inclusions of Paldea Evolved, Obsidian Flames, 151, Paradox Rift, Paldean Fates, Temporal Forces, and finally Twilight Masquerade. Unfortunately, the game, despite all this, is still pretty content dry. Meaning, yes, we're still lacking more content than what PTCGO had. Yes, the game is truly beyond static, and it feels like a spit in the face considering the potential was there. For clarification's sake, its star ranking is not moving at all. Since we last saw Pokemon TCG Online, the plug has just been pulled on the game. It's dead, and nothing more than a memory of times gone. Potentially just eating up storage on your computer because you forgot to uninstall it. Well, we know damn well we'll never be able to actually play the game again. And now, sadly, the emulation treatment does not apply here. Meanwhile, I'm weeping and malding over my Delibird coin being stolen. Yes, that's truly the worst part of it all. X and Y, Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, Sun and Moon, alongside their Ultra counterparts, are now victims of online play being put down. Yes, Nintendo thought all their fun online features weren't worth caring for, so they're just gone now. Thanks, Nintendo. Oh no, I'm not upset with you. The 3DS and the Wii U needed to be executed for their crimes of existing. I'm not gonna go on a constant generation back and play your competitive systems because they still have functional online. Don't be ridiculous. Since we last saw Pokemon Rumble U, this game has become abandonware. With the Wii U eShop as a relic of the past, this game joins its older brother in limbo of never being possible to buy and in turn play, while simultaneously being among a lineup of games that'll realistically never join the Switch's Wii U 2 library, which sadly means both games will likely never see the light of day again outside of emulation. Which, as a reminder, emulating Nintendo games is always morally correct to do. gamers, that's it for today. Yeah, I don't really know how to do an outro for this one, so thanks for watching, and yeah, that's it. This was just a trip of thing being inaccessible, another being deceased, 4 things getting worser, another thing getting goodered, and of course one that's actually content complete now, despite the nightmare-inducing frame rates. Yeah, okay, bye. And until next time, Game Freak, I'm just asking nicely, can you give me DLC for a game that I'll actually care about? Like, I want to give you money and feel good about it.